You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. The year was 1993. Paul Keating was the Prime Minister of Australia. I Will Always Love You was the #1 song on the charts. And one of Australia's worst serial killers was roaming the streets of Frankston, a beachside suburb in Melbourne. From Mamma Mia, I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening not to True Crime Conversations, but to No Filter. 18-year-old Elizabeth Stevens was walking home from a bus stop in Langwarrin on the evening of June 11 when a man jumped out towards her. It was dark and raining heavily, with gusting winds that muffled her screams. A month later, on July 12, a farmer made a gruesome discovery in a paddock at Carrum Downs. It was the body of 22-year-old mother Deborah Fream, who'd been reported missing just days earlier. She had a 12-day-old baby at home, and she'd just popped out, leaving him with a neighbour while she got some milk. Another month after these two tragedies, on the afternoon of July 30, a postal worker was delivering mail along Sky Road in Frankston North when she noticed an old, rusted Toyota Corolla parked nearby. It had no number plates, front or back, and there was a man hunched over in the driver's seat with a dark cap on his head. Something about him raised her suspicions, and with all the news reports about a killer on the loose, she decided to listen to her instinct, and she approached a nearby house, asked to use their phone, and called the police. In the short time it took the uniformed officers to arrive, the car's owners had spotted Natalie Russell entering a nearby walking track. It was a shortcut that ran between two golf courses on Sky Road. It was the middle of the afternoon. He followed her, ambushed her, dragged her body through a hole in the fence that lined the track, and murdered her, hiding her in the scrub. The officers were still circling his vehicle, taking down details when he returned. That man was Paul Denyer. His crimes terrorised the Frankston community, and decades later, the harm he caused is as real and raw for some as it was in 1993.
Now, the family of a murdered schoolgirl is calling for her killer to never be released from jail. Frankston serial killer Paul Denyer murdered 3 women in the 80s. 18-year-old student Elizabeth Anne-Marie Stevens, 22-year-old mother Debbie Fream, and 17-year-old schoolgirl Natalie Russell. Denyer was sentenced to life in jail, but later a non-parole period of 30 years was set, making him eligible for release next year. More than 32,000 people have now signed a petition to keep Denyer behind bars.
One of those people is Liberal Democratic MP David Limbrick, who was Natalie Russell's boyfriend when she died. He was just 19, and when her life ended, his was forever changed, just like all the families and friends of Elizabeth, Debbie and Natalie. What has brought them all together again, though, is the fact that in 2021, Paul Denyer applied for parole so that he could be released this year. And what nobody knew until then is that David Limbrick, who has been a member of the Victorian State Parliament since 2022, as the member for the South Eastern Metro region, of which Frankston is a part, has a very personal involvement in this case. David was kind enough to sit down with me and talk about Natalie and what's happened since she died. For those who aren't familiar with Frankston, what's it like as a suburb?
Look, it's a small city, really. It's fairly close to the city. It's on the bay. It's got a quite diverse population. You know, there's some areas that are pretty rough and some areas that are pretty fancy. They're a pretty tight-knit community down in Frankston. I think it's a really good town.
You were dating Natalie Russell at the time of her murder. How did you and Natalie meet? Were you at the same school?
No, we met at a party, actually. We were both teenagers at the time, and she came to a party and we met at a party and met a few times after that and ended up, hanging out together.
What was she like?
She was a very bright young woman, had a really sarcastic sense of humour. She was pretty cheeky with things, and she was a young woman with everything to look forward to in life. Yeah.
By the time of her murder, you guys had been together about 6 months, is that right?
Yeah, round about.
That's a really long time at that age.
It is. Didn't feel like a long time, but yeah, at that age, it is, I suppose. So, yeah.
Did you see each other much, or did you spend time together after school or on weekends?
Yeah, so we sometimes catch up on weekends or we meet up after school and things like that. Yeah, sometimes we go for drives and things, but yeah.
The murders happened within just a 7-week period in 1993. When Elizabeth Stevens' body was found, she was only 18. Do you remember that? And do you remember talking with Natalie about that?
On the first one, look, I remember when it happened. It was big news, of course, very violent and unusual crime. However, I don't think anyone at that stage thought that it was like a serial killer. I don't recall discussing it at that stage, but that certainly changed after the second victim.
When Debbie Fream's body was discovered, did the atmosphere in Frankston and surrounding areas change?
Yeah, Frankston totally changed when that happened because there was widespread speculation that we were looking at a serial killer. I don't think the police were 100% sure at that point, but of course they were investigating and many people began to panic. So Frankston was sort of gripped by fear and many women especially were really scared about what might happen and many women were staying home and this sort of thing. And I think at that point, that was when I said to Nat, please be careful and don't go walking around at night and this sort of thing. Like every other person in Frankston who knew a woman that lived there, they were concerned for their safety because we didn't know who committed these terrible, terrible crimes and what was going to happen next. So, yeah, it's hard to describe. I mean, someone described it recently. It's like lockdown almost. You know how when we had lockdowns in Melbourne, there was this sort of really dark vibe over the city. And I remember that sort of feeling in Frankston as well. Like, no one wanted to go out at night.
Were there a lot of police on the streets?
Yes. So after the second murder, the police launched an operation. I think it was called Operation Reassurance. And they dragged in police from all over the state. They had caravans set up on the street so citizens could provide information. They had police doing all sorts of stuff. But because the community was in such a state of terror, the police were trying their best to have a show of force on the streets and say, we're on top of this. We're going to catch this person. We're going to stop them committing any further crimes. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case, but that was their intent at the time, I believe. And, there was police everywhere.
Do you remember your parents talking to you, or was it really seen as this is just something for women and young women to be careful of and be alert for?
I don't recall having a conversation with my family about it, but it was clear that women were the target. That's what everyone was thinking at the time and turned out to be the case.
And did women change their behaviour, the women that lived around Frankston?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, many of the women I've spoken to even recently, it's had a lifelong effect on their behaviour. Like things like when poor Debbie Fream was taken, he hid in the back of her car. It's like something from a horror film. And, many women who lived through that even to this day will check the back of their car before opening it and things like this. Certainly they changed their behaviour. I heard stories of women arming themselves, not going out at night, not wanting to be alone, not taking public transport, because a lot of this happened close to train stations and public transport. So, yeah, there was certainly many changes in behaviour. Certainly young women would be asking for their parents, boyfriends, friends, husbands to come and pick them up rather than walk somewhere or get a train.
Paul Denyer didn't use the same method in terms of the circumstances with which he sort of targeted victims, but it was said that he had stalked women for a really long time. What was the difference between, without going into detail, the circumstances of Elizabeth's murder and Debbie's murder, the way that he sort of targeted them?
It's unknown. It was always thought that these were random attacks. There's been speculation more recently that, maybe they were targeted. I don't think we know the answer to that, but there was certainly some level of planning and some level of opportunism. He'd said he waited for rain because rain would wash away evidence and make it more difficult to see what was going on. So he was clearly thinking about that sort of thing in advance. He was armed as well, so that requires planning. It wasn't just some sort of random thing. There was a certain level of foresight and planning that went into it. But at the same time, it looks like some of these things were just opportunistic. He would have a plan. He would go out and look for a target, it seems like.
In these cases, we often see of women and young women being abducted and murdered that there is a sexual assault component as well. Was that present in these cases and in terms of Paul Denyer, or was that not his motivation?
My understanding is that there was no physical sexual assaults, whether it was underlying motivation had some sexual basis or not, I don't know. I'm not an expert in that, but certainly there was no sexual assault involved as far as I'm aware, although the crimes themselves were absolutely horrific.
When Natalie was taken, if it's not too personal, what do you remember about that day?
So that day, it was a Friday, and we were sort of hoping to meet up that night. It's a Friday night. Young people want to get together. A few other friends were sort of planning on getting together. And I was still at my home. I got a phone call from Nat's family asking me if she was with me, which was very odd. This would have been, early evening, because Natalie was very careful to, always tell her parents where she was, to not upset them and this sort of thing. And her just, taking off would be something very unusual. And I became very concerned when I got that phone call because I knew it was very out of character for Nat. She was always very careful to tell people where she was so they wouldn't worry about her. And when I started getting a phone call asking, is she with me? And I, of course, said no. That was a bit of a worry. Yeah. And so we ended up meeting up with some of the other friends and family members and just waiting. And as the wait went on and, went into the night, we started to think that something terrible had happened.
You say we. Who was with you? Was it your parents or other friends?
Some friends of ours, friends of Nat's and friends of mine and their families. But, as the night went on, we became, you always hold out hope in these things, but it became increasingly clear that something very bad had happened.
Did the police straight away say, we suspect it's this serial killer? Is that the conclusion that you all straight away came to?
Well, I didn't personally hear from the police until they identified her, but I think we sort of jumped to that conclusion because there didn't seem to be many other conclusions. As I say, it was very unusual for her to just take off like that. It was very out of character.
And how did you hear that they had found her body?
I got a phone call from the police in the middle of the night and, it was a bit of a shock. It was really just confirming what we had already suspected. But, it was a, terrible, terrible feeling and, it was a pretty bad day.
David, you were just still a kid, right? Like you were 19 years old. So you'd left school. What were the circumstances of your life around that time?
I just started university and, I was studying at Swinburne, actually in Hawthorne. We were sort of at that point where, I was just sort of starting my life as well.
Yeah.
And, Nat and I had plans and stuff. I know that she wanted to travel and she was interested in journalism and stuff. And we were looking forward to her, finishing school and go and travel and do stuff. And she was very conscientious at school. She was focusing on doing her work and she made sure that she did all her schoolwork and everything because she wanted to get good marks in her VCE. That was my focus at the time, was just on education, and that was her focus as well. And, going out and having fun with your friends, that's what you do at that age. But
absolutely.
It sort of fell apart for me after that. I ended up, dropping out of university and becoming unemployed, and a lot of other things, bad things happened. And fortunately, I turned that around eventually, but it wasn't a good time. And
losing someone under any circumstances is incredibly difficult. Losing someone in a horrific way is worse again. And then when it's part of a big public news story, I imagine there's just so many different layers. In the days and weeks after she died, when it was such a big story and yet your grief was so personal and so intense. What was that like for you?
I felt very lonely because there was a huge media feeding frenzy, right? And they were focused on the friends and family, and somehow they'd missed the fact that I was involved at all. And I was sort of happy with that because I saw the stress that everyone else was under having to deal with the media, and I wasn't ready for that. So I just sort of was left out of the story at that point. And I was sort of happy with that actually at the time because I didn't think I could deal with it. I didn't want to talk about it in public and I wasn't ready to do that. But yeah, I did feel very lonely because, you know, it's just like all this stuff is happening and you're watching it on TV and you're connected to it, but it's like someone else's story, not yours.
What was her funeral like?
Oh, it was pretty awful. I mean, it was at the school full of kids crying. It's one of the hardest things that you could imagine, really. None of the kids in the school took it well. And to this day, I imagine those kids don't forget that.
Did you have much contact with her family?
Yeah, a lot of contact afterwards and before, but we had a lot of contact. I used to go and visit them and try and help as best I could. Eventually, I ended up moving to the country to try and, you know, make a new start and restart university and stuff again, and lost contact for a long time until recently. And because of, you know, what had happened, we felt that we had to speak out and do something. And that was, you know, reestablish contact in 2021 over all of this.
How long after Natalie's murder was Paul Denyer caught, and how was he caught?
So he was caught like the next day, pretty much, I think. So what had happened is when he attacked Nat, he parked his car, was a little yellow Datsun without number plates, I think. He parked it on the side of the road and then went down this track and cut a hole in the track and did all this preparation. Again, I was saying, you know, he prepared these things, didn't necessarily target an individual, but certainly was preparing for a criminal act. And a postal worker, she noticed the car sitting there with no number plates and thought it was odd. And, you know, considering what had been going on, she felt compelled to report it. And so the police went down and checked out the car and everything. Might have been a little bit too late, though. And so eventually when they found her, you know, they linked the car to him. They went to his house. He was calm when they went to his house, apparently. And they brought him in for questioning, searched his house, of course. Initially, he denied it for a long time. The police went through, you know, very long questioning process. And eventually the police said that they'd found some of his skin in one of the wounds of Nat, and that they'd have DNA evidence shortly that would, you know, prove that he was the murderer. He had injuries on his hands, a cut, I think the knife, he cut himself by accident during the attack. And that's when he decided to confess.
The police said that she fought fiercely. Was it worse knowing that or better? I mean, when I say better, you know, it's 100 shades of horrific. But do you just have to compartmentalize that part of it?
Yeah, in a way. It doesn't bear thinking about in many ways. What you got to focus on, I think, is the fact that this person, he's an utter psychopath. Back then, he was a very, very dangerous man, and it's my belief he's still a very dangerous man. He not only murdered 3 women, he was also sentenced for abducted another woman. This was on the night that he took Debbie Fream. He attempted another murder that night and failed. And, you know, from the reports and stuff that happened later, you know, he'd been fantasizing about murdering women since he was 14 years old. He'd carried on all these other stalking attacks. He'd assaulted women. And these are only the crimes that we know of. I mean, he'd been cruel to animals, like killed animals. You know, this is just what we know about.
He pled guilty, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, so there was no trial.
Well, there was a trial because, of course, they had to establish the facts of the case. A confession doesn't necessarily mean that you're guilty. People confess to all sorts of weird things and they didn't really do it, but they wanted to make sure that all the facts of the case were laid out. The judge was Justice Vincent at the time. In his sentencing summary, he very rightly pointed out the horrific nature of the crimes. he very rightly pointed out how he's different to other people in our society. He needs to be separated from other people in our society. He also pointed out that at the time, according to the expert testimony from psychiatrists and many others, that there was no known medical treatments that could treat his disorder and no prospects of rehabilitation. That's why Justice Vincent sentenced him to 3 life terms without parole. And we felt when that sentence was handed down that he got it right. We felt some sort of closure, that we were reassured at the time that he wasn't going to hurt another girl again. And so as horrible as it was, we had some sort of closure that this wasn't going to happen again.
You mentioned, David, his disorder. What disorder did Paul Denyer have?
I can't remember the exact name. I think they called it sadistic personality disorder.
So he took pleasure in inflicting pain on others.
Yeah, and specifically women, it seems. I'm glad I don't understand how he thinks. I don't want to think like that. And I don't think that normal people can really understand how this sort of person thinks. He's very different to a normal person or even a normal criminal. You know, many criminals have motives like, you know, money or passion or anger or whatever it might be, and they can be rehabilitated and, you know, they make a mistake and things like that. But in this case, it's one of those really rare cases where there's something very, very seriously wrong and something's broken, and it just makes him so much more dangerous.
Coming up, the moment that David found out that Paul Denyer had applied for parole and the relationship that he now has with the other loved ones of the Frankston serial killer.
Just like with any other developmental milestone, kids progress at their own pace when it comes to staying dry overnight. And until then, they can rely on Dry Night's nighttime pants to help them wake up dry and worry-free. It's Dry Night's thinnest pant ever for undie-like comfort, so they can feel like the big kids they are. And they have rapid absorption for overnight protection, so they can wake dry and worry-free with Dry Nights.
So for a civilian like me who hears 3 life sentences with no chance of parole, how did we get to this point where in 2021 you heard that he was planning to apply for parole and that he would be eligible for parole this year in 2023?
Yeah, so what happened after the initial sentence was handed down, we tried to get on with our lives, and we heard through the media that there was an appeal. And this was like the next year in 1994. And an appeal was made on the original sentence. I think there was 3 judges on that appeal, and they ruled, it wasn't a unanimous ruling, I think one of the judges dissented, but they ruled that for technical reasons, which I won't go into, but for technical reasons, the original judge, so Justice Vincent, who handed down the original sentence, must set a non-parole period. Now, he originally said that if he's ever to be released, it'll have to be a decision of the executive government of the day. And I think the appeal court said that the judge can't delegate that responsibility to some future government. So therefore, they said that it was appropriate to set a non-parole period, and they set that non-parole period for 30 years. And so that set off a chain of events whereby we were shocked. You know, I didn't really understand the reasons why that happened. We were just shocked that it could ever have a chance of getting out. And so it set off this sort of 30-year wait for us. You know, we're waiting that one day he's going to apply for parole. And of course, fast forward 20-odd years, we end up in a situation where now I'm a member of parliament that happens to represent the area of Frankston as part of my electorate. And in 2021, I spoke with Karen, who was Nat's best friend, and a few other family members. And I said, well, we have to push the government to do something here. And we weren't being prescriptive, telling them what they should do. We just wanted some sort of reassurance that he's never going to hurt another woman. And, you know, it was a big media story back then, back in 2021, when we spoke out about it. People didn't know that I was involved with the case at all because I just sort of kept it quiet for a very, very long time. And what was apparent to me is that many of the friends and family were either, you know, 30 years ago, right? So a lot of people had passed away. A lot of people were not in a good state to speak publicly, and it became apparent that, you know, it was going to be me and Karen and a few others. Probably not many people could do this. So I sort of felt compelled to speak out and, you know, try and get the government's attention. And then, of course, you know, we did that, got lots of attention. The government wouldn't talk about it publicly other than sort of say, you know, we put our faith in the parole board, which is fine, I suppose, but, you know, it doesn't really give us any reassurance over the long term. And then, of course, last year he did apply for parole. You know, of course, we saw that was always going to happen. And that was a huge story in Melbourne, of course, because, you know, people were concerned. But I don't think our concern was that he would get out on his first parole attempt. Like there's other concerns here, right? How much longer are we going to have to fight this, like every parole attempt? And we're concerned that, you know, today the parole board made a good decision, but is every future board going to make that decision? And is the family and friends going to have to be re-traumatized every time this happens? And I just don't think that the status quo is acceptable, which is why I'm hoping that the government will do something to help with this.
What do you know about the time Paul has spent in jail, Paul Denyer, and what he's done with his life over these past decades?
I only know what I hear through, you know, I've listened to, you know, true crime podcasts and stuff which go into detail. I've read books, I've spoken to people, but everything seems to indicate to me that he hasn't tried to reform himself. He hasn't tried to make himself a better person. He's probably spent 30 years fantasizing about getting out. And he clearly thought that he had a chance of freedom here, which is why he applied at the first available opportunity. I haven't seen any evidence at all that he deserves any chance at freedom.
In 2021, he started identifying as Paula, claiming to be a woman. Is that the case? And what was that about?
That was actually quite a long time ago he did that. Yeah, he started identifying as a woman. That was back in the early 2000s that was happening. I've heard conflicting cases whether that's still the case, but to me that's irrelevant to, you know, whether or not he's dangerous. But yeah, I mean, he did say I think there was at some stage that, you know, he blamed his hatred of women on gender issues. But is that true? I mean, I don't know. I've got no idea.
When you apply for parole, what's the process? What do you have to prove and who gets to decide?
So I don't know the process in detail, but what I do know is that, yes, you have to make a case to the parole board. So the parole board is a group of legal experts and specialists and other people. And you have to make your case as to, you know, why you've reformed, what you've done different and how it's going to work when you get out, you know, where you're going to stay and all that sort of thing. And then they make a decision on whether they will accept that or not. Now, I'm sure it's much more detailed than that. That's the basics of it, though, as far as I know. Yeah. And
part of it is showing remorse and accountability and that you have been rehabilitated. Do you know anything about Paul Denyer's parole application and is that a matter of public record or it's private?
No, that's strictly confidential, so I don't know about that. You know, the family's the only thing that they were told is that he was applied and then it was published that he was denied, and that's all we know about it, really. No details of that go to the parole board are made public or even transmitted to families other than, you know, I think they're told that someone's made an application and they're told whether or not that application has been successful.
Is it as simple as someone being able to just say never to be released? I mean, I'm thinking of a big red stamp with a never to be released that just goes on his file. Does such a thing exist? Sort
of. So there's been some other cases where, so the case of Julian Knight, who was a mass murderer in Melbourne, and Craig Minogue, the Russell Street bomber, there was special legislation put through for them that effectively means that them being able to apply for parole is up to the parole board. So the parole board would have to make a decision on whether they would, I suppose, invite them to get parole. So effectively what it means is they can't continually keep applying for parole. Now, when we were campaigning to the government, we weren't prescriptive in saying that we wanted the same thing with Denya. Like, I'm open-minded. If the government doesn't like that approach and they've got some other way of doing it, I discussed some potential options with the government. You know, one potential option that I thought might be feasible is that people sentenced to multiple life sentences for murder would require ministerial approval to get parole or something like that. And that would actually restore it to the original sentence where Justice Vincent said it should be a decision of the executive government of the day, which I think the original sentence was correct, I think.
I'm so sorry that your life went so far off track. I'm not surprised after Nat's murder. How did you get it back? Because to look at you today and everything that you're doing and what you've achieved, that's a pretty big transformation from what you say.
Yeah, well, I suppose I just made the decision that, you know, I wasn't going to let it define the course of my life. You know, you're either going to go into a ditch and stay there, or you're going to pick yourself up and try and get things back on track. So, you know, as I said, I dropped out of uni, which I tried really hard to get into university. So dropping out was a really big deal. You know, I'd end up unemployed on the dole. And then I just made a decision, all right, I'm going to move to the country, try and get back into university. So I went to Ballarat University, moved to the country and ended up starting my degree from scratch, eventually passed, started a career in IT and became quite successful working in consulting and ended up working in finance and then eventually got involved in politics somehow. So I got things back on track. But, you know, a lot of people didn't. A lot of people, it had a terrible effect on their life, but not everyone can do that. So I'm fortunate that I was able to do that, but not everyone did.
It's true what you say because, you know, people know the names of his 3 victims, but there were so many more victims in terms of the lives that were forever changed. You know, Debbie Fream had a 12-day-old baby.
Yeah, Jake. And I've met Jake recently. You know, like until we did this campaign in 2021, I'd forgotten that there was this, you know, 12-day-old baby, right? And I was like, he must be like, you know, almost 30 years old. And he'd had a rough life, you know, as you would expect. Not surprising at all. But he's now moved back to Frankston and, you know, my understanding is he's getting his life back on track. So good on him. You know, he's got a job and stuff now and he's doing okay, is my understanding. So he's got people who are looking out for him. You know, I wish him all the best. And last time I saw him, he looked like he was doing pretty good. So, yeah.
It's like a terrible club that you're part of that no one wants to be in. You know, Nat's parents, Elizabeth's parents, Debbie's family and loved ones. Is there any sort of formal communication or do you see each other? Do you communicate in any way around terrible anniversaries and significant times like the parole situation?
Oh, look, we've been communicating a lot recently. You know, we've got a group chat and stuff set up and we talk a lot about things. And
that's literally the group chat nobody wants to be in.
Yeah. Look, it's actually really good support to be able to talk and just let each other, you know what's going on. There's been a lot of activity recently and it sort of helps to know what's coming up. You know, I told them that I'm meeting with you today so that, you know, it's not a shock for anyone. But, yeah, we support each other quite a lot. You know, we meet up at events and things occasionally. So I'm very close to many of these people.
I wanted to just finally ask you about, with the huge success of true crime, you know, true crime podcasts, true crime as a genre, I guess, it's just exploded. You're on the inside of it, you know, you and everyone on that group chat. How do you all feel about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'd never really had anything to do with true crime community. I wasn't really a fan of it. You can imagine why.
Not what you want to do in your spare time.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, lots of people are really into it and I think that they like to learn about the truth. But I've been in contact with Vicky Petratus. She's a true crime podcaster and I did an episode on her thing. And people have asked me this, you know, how do you feel about it? Well, in our case, I can't speak for everyone, but I think most of the other friends and family felt the same way. We were happy that someone was telling this story. You know, I'm very close to Vicky now, and I feel like she did it in a totally ethical way. She did it with the permission of the families and friends. She was trying to tell their story. I felt that it was totally ethical, the whole thing, and I was very happy that it was reaching a large audience, because the biggest fear is that people forget what happened. It was a long time ago. Then, you know, maybe they don't see the potential danger. And so we're very happy that the media was interested and that true crime people like Vicky Petratus had picked up this story and ran with it. And she's been telling this story for 30 years. She was actually there on the night they found Nat. She was in a police car doing a story. So she's been doing this for a very, very long time. So I don't see a problem with it. I see why people are interested in it. I don't have a problem with people being interested in those sort of stories. I think it's a natural human curiosity to know about human nature, especially in a case as unusual as this. You know, people want to understand, you know, why did this happen? Like, what sort of person does things like this, and how did it really happen? And these are normal sort of questions that an inquiring mind might want to know about. So I'm happy that people are interested, and I'm happy that people are telling the story.
And just finally, David, you know, I was thinking about you today and about war widows when they sort of hold up photos of their husbands that they lost in the war, and they are holding these photos of these young men, and they're like women with grey hair, and they look like they're from a completely different generation. You've spent so much of your life advocating, or so much of the last few years advocating for Nat and on behalf of all the families to keep Paul Denyer behind bars. I don't even know what my question is, but it's more the mental image of you as a 19-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, it was a long time ago.
And, a lifetime ago.
Yeah, and we were just kids, and most of my life has been beyond that rather than before it. I don't know, like in some ways it feels like a different era, but in some ways it feels like it just happened yesterday, right? It's upsetting to me now just as much as it was when I was a kid. But I've sort of got this different viewpoint on it now. Like, I'm sort of on a mission, right? And we've got a goal here, and I feel like it's easier for me now to keep it together because we have this sort of mission that we're on to achieve an objective. So I feel like there's purpose in talking about this sort of thing. I feel like there's purpose in it. So it's still upsetting, but it's less so because, you know, I see why we're doing it. It's not just because we enjoy it, because we don't enjoy it. It's not fun to talk about these things. It's not pleasant, but it's necessary.
And you've brought meaning to it, you know, for you and for Nat and Debbie and Elizabeth and all of their families and loved ones. I so appreciate you taking the time. I know that this must be just so hard, and thank you for all the work that you're doing to help keep women safe and help keep this monster behind bars.
And thank you so much for covering it.
If you want to hear more about this story, you can listen to our interview with Vicky Petratus, who David mentioned. She has been covering this story, the Frankston murders, for 30 years, and we interviewed her in depth on our True Crime Conversations podcast. We'll put a link in the show notes. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you would like unlimited access to the subscriber-only episodes that we make of No Filter, and if you'd like to support the work we do here, make sure you become a Mamamia subscriber by clicking on the link in the show notes. The executive producer of No Filter is Eliza Ratliff, with sound production by Madeline Joannou. I'm Mia Friedman, and thank you for having me in your ears.
Just like with any other developmental milestone, kids progress at their own pace when it comes to staying dry overnight. And until then, they can rely on Dry Night's nighttime pants to help them wake up dry and worry-free. It's Dry Night's thinnest pant ever for undie-like comfort, so they can feel like the big kids they are. And they have rapid absorption for overnight protection, so they can wake dry and worry-free with Dry Nights.